Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Listeners, Paula McLean is a New South Wales ambassador for and the immediate past deputy chair and patron of the Stella Prize. She is on the board of the Country Education Foundation, a member of the She Gives Advisory Group and a trustee of McLean Foundation, which supports conservation, education, domestic violence and literature. Paula also began the Nature Writing Prize. A former fiction and educational publishing editor, Paula is the author of Good Foods for Babies and Toddlers, along with 2 other parenting books. However, this year, Paula has joined the ranks of Australian fiction authors with the release of her debut novel, The One Remaining, published by Fearless Press and imprint of Bakers Lane Books. The One Remaining is a stunningly written book about a successful novelist who embarks on her memoir in order to confront and process the grief and fear she's carried with her since a traumatic childhood event. A novel so exquisite, listeners, so raw and beautiful in its exploration of difficult themes, but also the telling of the most divine love story that had me sobbing in the wee hours of the night. I read it in one sitting and have not been able to stop thinking about Hilary and her journey since finishing. So I'm sure you'll understand that I'm both honoured and delighted to welcome Paula to the podcast today to chat about her work. Hello, Paula.
Hello, Claudine. Thank you for that beautiful introduction.
It's my pleasure. And I wanted to say congratulations on the publication of this gorgeous novel. In fact, today is release day, isn't it?
It is indeed. It's October 1st.
So tell me what today means for you and how long have you been waiting for this book to make its way out into the world?
Claudine, I started writing The One Remaining 4 years ago. And I suppose when I began, as a debut novelist, I never really believed it would make its way into the world, but I had to keep going. I didn't plan the story particularly. I knew that I wanted to write a fictitious memoir, and I wanted the protagonist to be a female writer. It was a space that I felt comfortable in. But as I started writing, I wasn't entirely sure where I was going to take this story. And I began with the idea that Hilary, the protagonist, would come upon some diaries. And at this point, she's in her late 50s. She's been somewhat of a successful novelist. She has already written 5 novels and 1 collection of short stories. But she's also carried with her a burden from her childhood, which you mentioned earlier. And she decides perhaps memoir is the best way to face talking about that issue. And she's kept so much secret in her life from people she loves as well. So that's really where I began. But then I thought, if I'm writing the memoir of a writer, a novelist, I have to talk about her body of work, the books that she's published. So off to the side on a whiteboard, I developed a list of her books. And at this point, they were just titles. And as she published her work during her lifetime, I would bring in those novels and come up with a little storyline for them. But I was also trying to relate those storylines to Hilary's own life. So that was the structure that I started off with. But Hilary led me the whole way.
I'm so fascinated to hear that. And I love the way Hilary's published novels are actually listed in the front of the book, or sort of just before her story starts. And so, you know, we're really in her head as we begin this story. And I was just fascinated by the entire setup, and you've done an incredible job.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so, you know, Paula, it's clear that you've led a full life with your involvement in the publishing industry, as well as various organizations that amplify women's voices. So I guess I kind of wondered, at what point did you decide that you wanted to write a novel? And was there a particular spark of inspiration for Hilary's story?
Well, look, I think like many people, I'd been writing short stories. I'd never attempted to have them published. Just every few years, I would feel like writing a story, but just collected them. And it wasn't until I had finished a long period on the Stella board that I thought, Paula, you have time now. You have time to sit down and do what you've always wanted to do. But I began thinking I wanted to perhaps write personal memoir. And this might be an essay or a short piece that I would submit for publication. And within a day or so, I knew I didn't want to write my own personal memoir. It's very confronting. And in fact, in the beginning of the book, which I call a letter to my readers. Now, these are not my readers, these are Hilary's readers. I talk about the anxiety that we feel about telling our own stories. So that really was the genesis of it.
I gave a very short overview of the book in my introduction, but I wondered, could you tell me more about the story?
Yes, so I have Hilary sit down to write her memoir. And over several pages at the beginning of this novel, she really drills down into what do I want to say, what can I say, and how confronting this might be to people that she loves in her life. And really, these were my own thoughts about writing memoir that I was getting at. But of course, I was starting to develop the storyline. I introduced the idea that she had a family, that she had a sister, that she had a husband. But that's all you know at that point. And then I tell the readers, let's now go on to the real story that Hilary wants to tell. And that's chapter 1. And in chapter 1, we learn that Hilary loses a sister, and it's very traumatic for the whole family. In many ways, I then thought I wanted to tell the story of every woman. And so as I go through Hilary's life, at the beginning, she doesn't deal at all well with what's happened to her or her family. She feels abandoned by her family in many ways. And without giving away various plot points, I moved on through Hilary's life into university years, into adulthood, into her first jobs, and then as she begins to write. And as she becomes a writer, she has opportunities to travel, to go to other countries, and she takes those opportunities. I think perhaps that's enough to say about where I direct her life. But this whole notion of every woman, that although we don't all suffer the experiences that Hilary had, almost all of us have had many of those experiences that she experiences in life. And I think that's why I'm being told the book groups, for example, are really going to enjoy this book, because it is something that women and men can identify with.
I couldn't agree with you more on that, Paula. It taps into so many relevant and timely issues for both women and men, some of which I want to talk about in the course of this interview. But I want to say, in relation to your writing style, it was almost as if I was there with Hilary and she was telling me this story just over a cup of tea. It was so easy to read. And yet I can imagine that it would have been hard to write. You know, they always say that easy reading is the hardest writing, but you have done such an incredible job.
Well, thank you. I think, as all writers know, this was my own voice. I also, as various imagery would come into my head, I would go with it. Really, that feeling of where might this take me? And perhaps that's why people are seeing it as lyrical. Obviously, I am a wordsmith. I love words. I have my whole life. So, like all writers, I'm always trying to find interesting and at times trying to find beautiful ways to say things, even when the topics can be dark.
This is a first person point of view narrative, as it is a memoir. And so we are very deep inside Hilary's head as she begins to write about her past and the events which altered the course of her life, really. And the overwhelming sense I got as a reader is the repressive environment that Hilary grew up in. And I think you described a little bit earlier as her feeling abandoned. And I think even when the worst happens and her older sister Elaine vanishes, she's kind of left alone in her grief, isn't she?
She is. She's very much left alone. And her family, the circumstances were difficult. She doesn't, at this very young age, understand the marriage of her parents. She thinks this is what all marriages are. Again, without giving away the plot of the story, various things happen in those next few years as she's finishing school that really add enormously to this feeling of being alone, having been abandoned, and, what can I possibly do with my life? And she really loses a lot of self-confidence. She doesn't become a normal teenager going out to parties. She really very much goes into an internal space.
And to that end, she leads a fairly small life in many ways.
She does. She does. She doesn't have the kinds of experiences you would expect most young girls to have. So when she eventually arrives at university, she is for the first time beginning to lead a social life.
I talked about her being alone in her grief. And, obviously she's had this very traumatic thing happen to her with her sister's disappearance. And I feel like this keeps happening to her. It's like a compounding of grief and trauma that she keeps pushing down and compartmentalizing so she can actually get on with her life. But then it becomes a bit of a problem in the future, doesn't it?
Yes, well, because she's really chosen silence, almost a kind of mutism in talking about her childhood, talking about her early years, talking about growing up in a small town. She really can't draw on that because she's so suppressed those years. And so she tries to find clever ways to get around those conversations when people ask her, where did you grow up? Tell me about your family. And she continually tries to repress that part of her life.
She definitely comes to understand, I think later in life, I should say, Hillary definitely comes to understand that she has suffered depression, long bouts of it, in fact. But she never goes so far as to seek help or ever wanted to talk about her losses or even her fears, not even to her beloved husband. But these things have a way of bubbling to the surface, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. For Hillary, they bubble up in terms of dreams, and they bubble up in terms of truncated conversations that she has with people because she can't go any further. But she also has the experience of friendship and eventually of love. And it is really those experiences that finally give her the courage to really take a deep dive into what those early years meant to her.
Absolutely. So we mentioned that Hillary was a fairly successful novelist. In her late 50s, she's had a number of titles published. And on reflection, I think Hillary can see that she has, in various ways and in various stories, revealed important aspects of herself, but she definitely didn't see it at the time that she was writing them, did she?
No, she didn't. And I think that's true of most writers, really. Obviously, if you've published a few novels, you are hoping desperately that you might get longlisted for a prize. And then when you do, you can't quite believe it. And I would imagine that you often would think all these other books were better than mine. And I think this also goes along with, I think we often don't want to step into the limelight and are always thinking about, other people. In this case, other people on that long list or that short list. And Hillary thinks surely their works are much, much better than mine. And I have her have those kinds of conversations with a friend where they talk about how men seem much more comfortable talking about their successes than women do. And I think generally that's true. And the She Gives movement that I'm involved in is really partly about that. It's about stepping up and feeling much more comfortable about what you've done.
Now, there was a novel that Hilary had written called The Albatross, in which her protagonists, a married couple, seem to have a life free of expectations, a life free of a past or of any significant current obligations, which is kind of how she did to others in her life, because she never really told anyone everything about herself. She sort of, curated the things that she wanted to tell people about herself. So, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, well, I decided to make the themes of the albatross very much that. And the reason I wanted to do that was to reflect the fact that Hilary herself never wrote about families. In all the books she wrote, she didn't include sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, mothers, fathers. She started their lives as adults. So that was very much a reflection of Hilary herself.
Yeah, indeed. Which brings me to the idea of creativity generally and writing specifically as a way of processing difficult emotions like grief and trauma. I've actually talked about this a number of times on the podcast. And the general consensus is that writing about difficult issues in an author's life can be cathartic, even if not writing about the actual events themselves. So I wanted to ask you, why was this something you wanted to explore in Hilary's story?
Well, look, I'm not sure myself if I were to write my own memoir that I would do it for those reasons at all. Unlike poor Hilary, I've had a very lovely life and a very wonderful childhood and all of that. But I needed Hilary to carry this baggage with her. And therefore, reading her diaries, going back and reading these diaries, which started the whole process for her, and then deciding to embark on the memoir, I thought some good will come of this. And I wanted Hilary to believe that some good would come of this. Telling our stories is so terribly important. From the beginning of time, humans need to tell their stories. Whether or not it's always helpful to a person, I don't know. But for Hilary, it was.
As previously mentioned, you're involved in various organisations. You mentioned She Gives, but one in particular I'm also aware of is the Pop In organisation in the Southern Highlands, which supports women and children who live in fear of domestic violence and abuse. This is a theme that finds its way into Hilary's story as well. And I wondered if you could talk more about this and why it was something you wanted to explore.
Because I embarked on a plan to write about every woman, in quotation marks. Domestic violence, we know, is so widespread, has been so repressed for so many decades and centuries, really. But I think we're at a point in time where we're beginning finally to be able to talk about this. With our family foundation, I think had we started that foundation 20 years earlier, there would have been very few domestic violence organizations that we could have supported because it was in the too hard basket. People didn't want to give to topics like that because it was so hard to talk about. They didn't want to believe it was so rife. But of course it is now. I suppose I would say the first donation I ever made as a young adult woman was to an organization that set itself up in King's Cross called Lou's Place. And I didn't know a great deal about domestic violence. I just knew that these women and children needed support. So that was really my first introduction to thinking, really starting to think deeply about domestic violence. And as you mentioned, much more recently now, we support Pop in the Southern Highlands, a setup to support women and children. And in many ways, this community is thought to be quite a well-to-do community, the Southern Highlands. But in fact, domestic violence has a place in virtually every socioeconomic group in the country. And in fact, what Popin discovered is that there was a great deal of need in the community to support women and children in this way. So that relationship that I have with Popin, of course, has informed me as well about what women live with who are suffering this, what their children live with, and how this impacts their life and their children's lives. I also have read and followed the journey of Anne Summers and all of the work that she has done in domestic violence as well. As you might know, in Stella, I think it was in 2020, Jess Hill won the Stella Prize for an absolutely searing book about domestic violence in this country. So it's something that many, many, many women suffer from. And it's also now something that we all think about a great deal and are trying to find solutions to. So in writing my Every Woman's Story of Hillary, I thought I've got to bring domestic violence into this story. So it was a very conscious decision. What that would look like, I had no idea. It evolved. It evolved as I wrote.
You've done incredible justice to the topic in this story. But in saying that, I wanted to talk briefly about the fact that Hillary's grief, I think, in many ways, simply didn't allow her to see the suffering of others. She saw this, I think, in her entry diaries too, but she kind of developed a narrow sense through which she viewed life, one that favored perhaps her need for self-preservation. Would you agree with that?
Yes, no, absolutely. It was there was a lot of self-preservation in what she was doing. And I would say hats off to Hillary for finding a way to try to process what she was going through. So she would take a step forward with that process and then she would step back. There's a character in the book that is an auntie of hers, and she does keep in contact with this one family member throughout the book. And she desperately wants this aunt to recognize what Hillary could so clearly see in terms of the characters that were suffering domestic and family violence. This is a small town. This is in the 70s. Police didn't know how to handle situations of domestic violence. And I think I have Hillary say at one point to the police sergeant that, you always say it's just domestic violence. The word just, of course, is the problem. It was at a time when police, weren't trained in this, didn't have the skills. And slowly, as we go through the decades, she remains in contact with this police sergeant, and she can see that he's taken it all on board, that police are beginning to get good training to deal with these families. That theme does follow right through the book.
So I think through Hillary's relationship with her beloved husband, now I don't know if it's Rico or Richo. I don't know how to say his name.
Well, in my head, it's Rico. Claudine, I have a friend who encouraged me to take Hillary to Italy. And then when I decided to introduce this character, of course, I was madly Googling names of Italian men, and I landed on Rico, but I never actually Googled how it was pronounced. So in my head, he's always just been Rico.
Oh. So I was going to say that I think through Hillary's relationship with Rico, she finally begins to understand that her parents' marriage was not normal and that her relationship with her parents was also not normal, and that she need not fear being truthful with her husband about her past and the things that happened. And I think what you've done so brilliantly here, Paula, and maybe tell me if I'm drawing too long a bow, but in doing this, I think what you've done is shown the difference between not only good and bad relationships, but perhaps how love can make room for differences.
I very much agree with that. And I wanted Rico to be the kind of man who lets Hillary grow. He knows that she holds back a great deal, but I think he trusts that love will get them there and that she will slowly, find the opportunities and the words to be more open with him. And that starts to happen slowly in the book. In particular, I have Hillary talk about a poem that she had written, a poem so dark, so difficult that she couldn't read all of it to him. So she only read a tiny bit. And I think for her, it was a test. Will he understand this? And he does. And I think she then really felt, I'm safe now. And I can tell Rico much, much more.
Now, you mentioned also that you took Hillary to Italy, which was a wonderful experience for her. But she goes there on a writing residency. And in fact, throughout the book, she's had a number of these writing residencies. She's been quite lucky in that space. So tell me about that. Why were these important to her journey as a writer? And have you done many writing residencies?
No, I haven't. I haven't. Hillary, a few were set up for her. So one, her friend living in New York, really organized that for her. London, this was 1980s. Every Australian wanted to go to London. So I find through her job an opportunity for her to go to London. But she goes there to work for ABC Radio. And Pontremoli in Italy, which is in the northernmost part of Tuscany, that was a residency again offered to her originally by a London friend who knew a couple who had a house in Tuscany that they'd liked to rent out, or not rent out, but to give to writers for residencies. So again, they were opportunities that came to her, and she took them. I should probably say that I have a love of this town, Pontremoli. My husband and I have been there a few times, and the house at the bottom of the valley is the house that I have Hillary stay in.
I wondered if it was based on a real house.
No, I think it's so important that every writer knows you cannot write about a place that you have not been, that you do not know well. And a funny story about that was when I decided to take 3 characters in the book across Australia. Originally, I intended for them to end up in WA, but that was going to involve them driving across the Nullarbor Plain. And I thought, I've not been across the Nullarbor Plain. I can't possibly write about that. So I have them end up in Ceduna, which is just before you begin the Nullarbor Plain journey. But of course, I hadn't been to Ceduna. And my husband's a writer as well. And we share a desk, a big library table. And he's on one side, I'm on the other. And I looked up one day and I said, darling, have you ever been to Ceduna? My husband's an Australian. And I said, have you ever been to Ceduna? And he said, no, I haven't. And I said, would you like to go? And so the two of us planned a trip and we went out and had some time in that part of the world and in the town of Ceduna.
We didn't mention the Canberra residency that Hillary undertakes, which ends up being really very serendipitous for her, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And I introduced 2 characters in that way. One, of course, is Martin, who's an academic and a published essayist. They meet at a writing event, and she learns that he, every summer, goes to the South Coast and likes to help writers for 1 month, letting them have his house. And so that was the vehicle to get Hillary somewhere else, in this case, Canberra. And it also became the vehicle to introduce Rico as well.
Well, I wanted to chat about your journey to publication a little bit because Baker's Lane Books is relatively new on the publishing scene. And in fact, The One Remaining is the first release for Baker's Lane and indeed the first under their Fearless Press imprint. So I was wondering if you could talk to us about that and how this came about.
Oh, it's a wonderful story because, in fact, it involves my daughter. So my daughter is Ginny Grant, and Ginny is the brand new publisher of Baker's Lane Books, which will be for fiction and nonfiction, memoir, etc. But she also wanted to support debut women writers. So she started Fearless Press, and Fearless Press is only for debut women writers. And as well as that, she wanted to start a prize. And so she's also started the Fearless Prize, again for debut women and gender diverse writers. And in fact, the wonderful Emily Bittow has just joined Ginny and will be judging that prize this inaugural year for it. The story behind that story is that Ginny had been in publishing for over 20 years as a senior editor working in fiction, nonfiction, children's books. And she very much wanted to step in to the publishing space, but in a way that would support really women and men, debut writers, who are struggling to get through to the major publishing houses. So she's taking a big risk. She asked one day if she could read my manuscript. She'd seen that I was struggling to find a mainstream publisher, and I hadn't shown either of my daughters this manuscript. I think it's quite confronting to send something you've written to your children. But she asked if she could read it. I gulped and sent it to her, and had the most wonderful experience the next day when she called to say, I couldn't stop reading this novel and I would like to publish it. So this was really how it all began. And it's been such a joy to work with Ginny at Baker's Lane. I suppose she's watched her mother in the literary prize space now her whole life as well. But of course, the Stella Prize is for published works. These books already exist and they're submitted by their publishers, but there's relatively little for debut unpublished writers. So it was a small thing that she felt she could do.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful story. And I could think of no better manuscript for Ginny to start with than this one, because I, like her, could not stop reading this book and I absolutely adored it. And I feel like this is going to be something very special.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Okay, so what's next for you, Paula? Are you thinking about another manuscript, or have you just been exhausted by this process and you just can't think beyond the next little while? I don't know. Tell me what's happening.
Well, at the moment, it's all about the wild ride. So podcasts like this one, obviously. I had a wonderful pre-publication review by Books and Publishing. The media have stepped in. There's now been a number of stories about what I'm doing, but also what Ginny Grant is doing as well. Sharing that with her has been really quite exciting. But I do have some ideas. I have actually begun to give quite a bit of thought to another novel. And what I'm planning to do is to take one of the characters from one of Hilary's books and write that novel. You will remember there's one book that's called Janet's Story. Janet is the character that I would like to explore, quite a bit more. So we'll see. We'll see how I go. I also have, I'm collecting short stories. I would love to be able to think that in the next year or two, I would finish those as well and find a path to publication for them.
That sounds wonderful and very busy, I must say.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, so Paula, you might know that there are a lot of writers that listen to this podcast. And given all of your experiences to date and your work with Ginny and Baker's Lane, I wondered if you had any tips for writers.
Goodness, I think being a debut writer, I probably don't have as many tips as established writers would have. But when you want to write, you just write. You just have to keep writing. And I think trust that you will find a publisher. It can take a very long time. If you have opportunities to submit to prizes like the Fearless Prize and other prizes for unpublished manuscripts, you should certainly do it, because that means you're putting it out there. And even though you may not win the prize, it's quite a good process to take that leap and submit. I think submitting short stories, I think, is a really excellent way to begin. I don't know why I never did submit. I did submit one recently and it has been published, but I could have been submitting them for a long time and I didn't. But most of all, I think just trust that, you have this great need to write and follow that instinct. And I think also, if you feel that a work is heading off into a strange direction, I would say let it, see where it leads you, because that's what I found. Following some of the imagery that I used in the book, it took me to unusual places and then allowed me to think slightly differently about what I wanted to do. So I guess take chances with your writing is what I would say, and don't stop.
On a final note, if there was one thing that you would like readers to take away from this book, Paula, what would that be?
I think it would be to always find agency in what you're doing. So I had Hillary struggle with this, but she did. She found ways to keep at least letting some people know what was happening in her life. And in terms of domestic violence, she kept on in very tiny, small ways, stepping into that space and not letting it get buried in the busyness of life. So I think agency is such an important thing for people to do. If you are passionate about something, if you care about something deeply, if you recognize so much more needs to be done, find a way to get involved.
It's been such a privilege to talk to you about this book. Thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you so much, Claudine. It was an absolute pleasure.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading.